Hi, my name is Mark, one of the pastors at Trillium. It might be useful to give you a little overview of Paul the Apostle's early years. Most scholars agree that Jesus was probably crucified in 30 AD. Probably a couple years after that, Paul has his road to Damascus experience, so we put that like +2. At the most +3, but probably +2. And he has his road to Damascus experience where he meets Jesus. Paul says in one of his letters that he goes off to Arabia for 3 years, and then he comes back and he meets with Peter and James in Jerusalem. They're the head of the church. So he goes essentially back to ground zero of Christianity, and he spends 2 weeks with them. And one presumes that he was instructed in the faith, because while he had the Jesus experience, he doesn't understand what it really means. And then he goes out about on his missionary adventures. And then later in 48, he meets up with Peter, James, and John in Jerusalem again. And they compare notes in a sense of what they've been teaching. And they find that they're still in agreement on the core essentials. And then Paul visits the Corinthian church, Corinth, a city in Greece, in 50, roughly about 50. And then about 5 years later, he writes to the Corinthian church his first letter to them. And in that first letter, he recounts the whole matter of resurrection. In fact, chapter 15, if you go through chapter 15, this whole chapter is about the resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead and our resurrection from the dead. And he begins the discussion by referring to what now scholars agree is a creed, an early Christian creed, verses 3 to 8. It's a creed. It goes like this: Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, was buried, was raised on the dead in accordance with the Scriptures, and then appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12, then to the 500, then to James, and then to all the apostles. The vast majority of New Testament scholars, whatever they believe, and believers, non-believers, skeptics, atheists, they all agree that this is an early Christian creed that Paul is referring to, because he makes reference. This was given to me, and now I'm handing it on to you. In fact, he reminds the Corinthians this is what he taught them when he visited them. So now we're going from 55 AD back to 50. We're only plus 20 years after the death of Jesus. Question scholars asked was, how much farther back does this creed go? Well, most scholars put it back around at least to 35 AD. That when Paul goes to meet with Peter and James, that creed is in existence. In the basic outline: death, burial, raised from the dead, resurrection, and appearances. This creed was in existence, what Paul was taught at that time. But most scholars actually will date the creed even earlier. They'll go back to +2. I want to remind you, this is whether they're believers or non-believers. They agree that the creed was in existence at least no later than 2 years after Jesus' death. So within 2 years of Jesus' death, the church is proclaiming that he died, that he was buried, that Jesus was raised from the dead, and that Jesus appeared to the disciples. And some scholars will take it back to within 6 months of Jesus' crucifixion and death. That within 6 months, the early church was proclaiming not only the death and burial of Jesus, but his resurrection and his appearance to the disciples. The question for us is, well, what do we make of that witness, that testimony? I mean, we can't simply dismiss it off as something that was added on 25, 50, 100, 200 years later. This is something that goes to the very heart of the original Christian proclamation to the world. You know, Jesus died for our sins, was buried, was raised from the dead, and now has appeared to the disciples. You know, in any historic claim, we're always going to use circumstantial evidence. Because there's no original witnesses left anymore. We can't go back right to the source. We didn't experience it, and we don't know anybody who was an original experiencer of, for instance, the Jesus appearances, who met the Lord post-death. So we don't know for sure in an absolute sense what happened there. So we have to trust on the witnesses. How good is this witness? How good is the witness? I mean, any historical claim ultimately rests on witnesses. I mean, you know your birthday, I presume. How do you know you were actually born on that day? Well, your parents told you were born on that day. Why would you not trust them? If you didn't have confidence in them, you could look at your birth certificate. The government says you were born on that day. If you don't trust that, you could talk to old neighbors and old family friends, old family members, and they might confirm the date that you were born on. If you're still not convinced, you go down to the hospital and look at the records and see your entry on the date they said you were born on. Maybe there was a birth announcement in the local newspaper at the time that you can find in the archives. And they all confirm circumstantially that you were born on this day. Doesn't prove it 100%, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming that you were born on that day. Question is, how strong is the evidence that the early church's belief in Jesus being raised from the dead is actually true? Well, all I can say is this, in simple form. The early church certainly behaved like Jesus was raised from the dead. They certainly believed it. And they built their life and organized their lives around this reality of Jesus being raised from the dead. And you just have to look at what the early church did. The quality of their witness, the way they dedicated their lives to carrying this message out into the world, the way they lived with each other, how the centrality of love was at the center of all that they did. You just have to look at the early witness of the church to know that they believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And the question for me is, since I'm struck by the life they lived in response to the witness, I'm prepared to take their witness as my own.